This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief over at numberfire.com, and this is episode 147 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the Numberfire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The NFL goes through some pretty serious turnover each year. Teams come out of nowhere and perform well all the time, and then the opposite happens as well. And I think this has pushed fans, and specifically fantasy owners, to sort of devalue the process of predicting team success. Or maybe I should say fantasy owners care a lot less about season-long schedules because there's a lot of variance to predicting how good or bad a team is going to be at certain aspects of the game. And I get that, but how is it any different than when we're making fantasy football projections? There's loads of variance with a player projection or a ranking, but even knowing that, fantasy owners are utilizing those tools when they're drafting their fantasy teams. So if it's okay to project a stat line for Todd Gurley, shouldn't it be okay to project how a certain team unit is going to perform? Now, I'm not of the belief that a player's schedule is everything. This is just another piece to the preseason fantasy football puzzle. But I'm definitely a believer that we should try and find every angle to gain an advantage in fantasy football, and looking at schedules is definitely one of those angles. More specifically, looking at early season schedules can be really beneficial for a few reasons. First, everyone is healthy, so we generally know the kind of personnel a team is going to have at the start of the season. But the second reason is a little bit more game theory related. If a player has a bad start to the season, sometimes it can be thanks to a tough early season schedule. If a wide receiver is facing top cornerbacks across the first 3 weeks of the year, and if that wide receiver underperforms, then there's a pretty obvious reason as to why he underperformed. So instead of drafting that player, you can always try and buy low on that player after those first 3 games. But there's also this component of doubt. If you draft a dude in the 3rd round and he's provided nothing through the first 3 weeks of the season, even if you know he's had a tough schedule, you may still doubt his ability. And having doubt when you're making week in and week out lineup choices can lead to poor decision making. So given all of this, I thought it'd be a good idea to analyze the early season schedules for relevant players across the league to find guys to target and avoid in your fantasy football drafts. Before digging in though, I wanted to let you know that with the British Open starting on July 19th, FanDuel is bringing something new to the tournament. It's called Quick Pick, and it's the simplest way to play fantasy golf. What makes it so simple, you ask? There's no salary cap. That's right. Quick Pick contests have no salary cap. Instead, the player pool is divided into tiers from stars all the way to sleepers. Just make your picks from each tier and you're ready to tee off. It's that simple. And you can try Quick Pick for a shot at $100,000 in prizes during the British Open. Just go to fanduel.com/campaign-quickpick to learn more. That's fanduel.com/campaign-quickpick. Now let's analyze these early season schedules, starting things off with players you may want to consider targeting in your fantasy football drafts this year, thanks to favorable matchups to kick off the season. One of the things that I can't stand with quarterback analysis in fantasy football is when the fantasy community cites low-end QB1 season-long finishes as a good thing, like how Phillip Rivers is consistently a top 12 quarterback. That doesn't really matter to me. When you can effectively stream a QB6, a QB7, or a QB8 in a lot of fantasy leagues, I don't care if a player is always in the QB9 or QB10 range. So when you hear that Matthew Stafford has been a top 10 finisher at the position in each of the last 3 years, that shouldn't be the reason that you draft Matthew Stafford. You shouldn't care about that. Instead, Stafford's a really attractive option because of his early season schedule. Detroit starts things off with a game against the Jets at home, and while I do think the Jets secondary isn't that bad, Detroit will be a strong favorite in that game. You want to target quarterbacks who are strong home favorites. After New York, Detroit gets San Francisco, New England, and Dallas. All 3 of those opponents should be beatable through the air this year, and those contests against San Francisco and New England could also be pretty high scoring. And you could even make the argument that a home game in Week 5 against Green Bay is a strong one for Stafford as well. So to reiterate, I don't like Stafford because he's consistently finished as a QB1 over the last 3 years. I like Stafford because he's got a great schedule to start the season. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's a top 5 guy after the first 5 weeks of the season. I'm also intrigued by the running back who will take some of Mark Ingram's work to start the season in New Orleans. We know that Alvin Kamara will get his, but it's unlikely that Alvin Kamara is going to handle 60 to 70% of the team's workload, given that would be more than double what he saw last year. Who that player will be is unknown, but he could really be a strong fantasy asset to start the season, or at least a low-key strong one. Because New Orleans could see some nice positive scripts at the start of the year. They first get a Jameis Winston-less Bucs in week 1, and then they'll face Cleveland in week 2. So I do like the Saints' passing attack, of course, but they're already double-digit favorites in some places against Tampa Bay. So whoever is taking Ingram's place could see more touches than we might think. Two other players that I want to call out with good early season schedules are Alex Smith and Jared Cook. To all you streamers out there, these could be two players to target in your drafts this season. With Alex Smith, I'm not expecting the same type of production that we saw last season because last season was an outlier for Alex Smith. I've talked about this on the podcast before. 40% of Alex Smith's passing yards last season came on deep balls when his previous high on Kansas City was about 27%. And half of his touchdown passes were on deep ball passes. I don't mind his weapons in Washington, but I do think there are plenty of question marks, especially on the outside. But Washington starts their season against Arizona, who has a lot of holes in their secondary outside of Patrick Peterson. And then in week 2, they'll get the Colts, who will almost certainly be one of the best matchups for quarterbacks this season. So those are two strong matchups to open the year for Alex Smith. And then with Jared Cook, we're looking at a much more deeper solution. I'm still of the belief that your tight end strategy this year should be to target a Trey Burton or a George Kittle type and shoot for upside, or if you'd like, snagging Gronk when he falls in drafts. Jared Cook is more than likely not a long-term solution for your roster. But there have been rumors this offseason around Martavis Bryant, and if something does happen to Bryant, and I'm not saying something will, but if something does happen to Bryant, that would allow an opening for Jared Cook. But regardless of that, I like his schedule to start the year. The Raiders get the Rams in week 1, who invested heavily at cornerback, which may make them a lower key decent matchup against tight ends this season. Passes are going to be forced to the middle of the field. Then they'll get Denver, Miami, and Cleveland. Denver struggled against tight ends in recent years, and Miami and Cleveland are not strong defensively. Like I said, I'm still a fan of getting some of those lower end tight end ones in drafts, but if you're in a pinch and you need a streamer, Jared Cook could be your dude. I'm not expecting much, but the schedule is definitely there. On the opposite side of things, so guys that you should avoid, is LeSean McCoy. And clearly, since this is a podcast about targeting and avoiding players based on their early season schedules, this is not because I'm fearful of a LeSean McCoy suspension. I mean, I am fearful of that, but this has nothing to do with it. Push all of that aside and assume nothing is happening off the field for LeSean McCoy right now. As I alluded to on the mailbag episode last week, I'm not into LeSean McCoy this season for plenty of reasons. He just turned 30. His offensive line could be really bad this year, and his quarterback situation is more than likely going to also be bad. And then Buffalo doesn't have many weapons to take pressure off of LeSean McCoy. And his early season schedule is brutal. It is so rough. The Bills will take on the Ravens, Chargers, and Vikings to start the year. It'd be tough to find a tougher trio to kick off the season than those three teams. And then after week 3, McCoy will face an improved Green Bay defense, another improved one in Tennessee, and then Houston. Whether it has to do with players coming back from injury or off-season additions, those three teams look way better defensively on paper today than they did last season. I just think there's a lot not to like about LeSean McCoy this year. And again, that's off-season issue aside. When you factor that in, he's going to have to fall significantly for me to draft him. Someone who I actually love this season, but unfortunately has a rough start to the season schedule-wise, is Marcus Mariota. He's someone that I've talked about this offseason from a positive regression standpoint. He finished last year with a 2.9% touchdown rate when he saw a 5.1% rate during his rookie year and a 5.8% one 2 seasons ago. And Tennessee also ran for more touchdowns than they threw for last year, which is something that will naturally regress into this season. That, to go along with Mariota's rushing ability, is why he's honestly an ideal late-round quarterback target. Those are all the things that I've talked about before, though. I haven't talked about his schedule. Mariota's fine in week 1 because Tennessee's going to face Miami. No big deal there from a matchup standpoint. But after Miami, you're looking at Houston, Jacksonville, Philly, Buffalo, Baltimore, and then the Los Angeles Chargers. 4 of those teams are in Number Fire's top 5 preseason pass defense rankings. So like I said, I think Mariota's fine to draft if you're planning on streaming because Miami shouldn't be a rough matchup for him. But I'm a little bit fearful of his performance after that point. Brandon Cooks is another player who scares me. Not just because there are question marks as to the type of volume that he's going to see in the Rams offense, but in weeks 2 through 4 this year, Cooks will see snaps against Patrick Peterson, Casey Hayward, and Xavier Rhodes. The Rams face the Raiders in week 1, so Cooks should be fine from that perspective, but I think the main concern with Cooks is that it's not as though the Rams have to force feed him the ball. This isn't an Antonio Brown situation where cornerback matchups matter less because he'll still see volume. The Rams have alternatives. So on top of me wanting Robert Woods or Cooper Kupp at their average draft positions as opposed to Brandon Cooks at his right now, we're walking into the potential of Cooks facing 3 tough corners in the first 4 weeks of the season. That could inherently lower his trade value. And you, the potential Brandon Cooks owner, may start to hesitate when you're locking him into your starting lineup. That's not what I want out of an early round player. And then the last player, or players I guess, that I want to mention today that you may want to avoid due to early season schedules are Peyton Barber and Ronald Jones, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield. They'll kick off the season without Jameis Winston, so automatically you're nervous for some negative game scripts. Because a negative game script could mean fewer opportunities for those running backs. And then you realize that they're facing New Orleans, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh across those 3 games. Those are 3 teams with some of the best Super Bowl odds in the league entering the season. And of course, this is in addition to Barber and Jones maybe splitting up the backfield to start the year. So in the end, it feels like a situation where you may be able to just buy Ronald Jones a little bit further into the season as opposed to straight up drafting him. He's got a lot of upside though. A couple of big runs could keep him elevated despite the negative game scripts that he might see. But the matchups without Jameis Winston absolutely worry me. That's it though. On the positive side, or guys with favorable matchups, you've got Matthew Stafford, the Saints backfield, Alex Smith, and Jared Cook. Players with unfavorable starts this year are LaShawn McCoy, Marcus Mariota, and the Titans passing attack, Brandon Cooks, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs. Now, I'm obviously recording this in July, so a ton can and will change. And to reiterate what I said at the top, this is merely another piece to the evaluation puzzle. This isn't to say that you should absolutely avoid or target these guys because their schedules are great or not great. But it's definitely another way to gain an edge over your opponent. And winning those small battles is how you take home a championship at the end of the year. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks so much for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And when you're on iTunes, make sure you're leaving me a rating and review. I'd greatly appreciate it. I'm also on Twitter at LateRoundQB. If you have any questions for this week's mailbag show, you can hit me up on there or email me at jj@numberfire.com. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.